Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of the program. Today we're going to talk about this article that came out from National Geographic titled "The First Europeans Weren't Who You Might Think." So I remember on Grimerica a few months ago, which by the way, if you guys have iTunes or the podcast app for the iPhone, I forget which, I think they're both the same, I don't know. The episode that I was on a month or and a half ago or so, on the Grimerica podcast show, and I highly recommend you guys go check it out if you haven't already. They have an intro on the podcast version, and their YouTube version comes out on the day they record, and then sometime later, whenever they feel like it, they upload it on their platform. I have a link to it in the description, but yeah, be sure to check it out. And on that show, I talked about the Scythians, or the Scythians, however you want to pronounce it. This is their well, we'll get to this in a second. So anyway, this article revolves around the first Europeans, and the Scythians have something to do with the peopling of Europe. And this article makes a case for three different quote peopling events, these migrational events in which the population already existing in Europe was either driven out or completely or almost completely replaced with the new incoming population. And this article is really interesting because it has a lot to do with what I was talking about on the Grimerica podcast in terms of the Scythian people and their relation to the Proto-Indo-European people. Now, if you guys don't know what the Indo-European language is, here's a good graphic of the current extent of Indo-European language family, and it stretches as far west as Portugal and Spain, all the way to the other side of Russia and Siberia, and all the way down to most of the Indian subcontinent. So all of this is the linguistic aspect of these Proto-European people. Now, the question has long been asked where the homeland, the original homeland of these Indo-European language speaking people originated, and there are three hypotheses. One is the Anatolian hypothesis, which posits that the original people came from Turkey and Anatolia and then spread everywhere else you see on the map. And Anatolia on this map is right here where my cursor is. The second, one of the other hypotheses is the Armenian hypothesis. Basically the same thing, but it originated in the southern Caucasus, where modern day Armenia is. And then the third hypothesis, which is the most widely accepted, is the Kurgan hypothesis, which posits that the people came from the Pontic Steppe, which is where the Scythian people tend to originate from, depending on who you ask, which is basically near the Black and Caspian Seas right here. And again, that is the most prevalent theory. No matter how you slice it, the story is basically the same. There are these people from the steppe, and because of their military prowess, their pastoralist way of life, their values in life, in which they weren't a very materialistic people. They could take or leave whatever it is in terms of items go, artifacts go. They didn't really value those things. What they valued most was stuff that could keep them alive, like their animals, their farming techniques, and obviously the culture that they were brought up in, and conquering other people and spreading out. And those were the two things. Let me show you this quote here by this historian Tragus Pompeius, and this is what he had to say about the Scythians specifically. He says, "They are a nation hardy in toils and warfare. Their strength of body is extraordinary. They take possession of nothing which they fear to lose and covet, and when they are conquerors, nothing but glory." Okay, I read that pretty terribly, but you guys get the picture. They were no nonsense. They didn't dabble in the materialistic goods that we do today, and the Romans did in their day. They didn't really care much about property rights or anything like that. They were very, again, like I said, hardy people who left their genetic marker all over Europe. Russia, Siberia, India, Iran, Anatolia, all up in the Middle East, pretty much everywhere you see on this map. And to this day, their language, there exists this residue of their mark that they left. It's very interesting stuff. And then the Yamnaya culture is what they're talking about in this article. And the Yamnaya culture is these people who originated right before the Bronze Age, around 3,500, almost 4,000 BC, around there. So depending on who you ask, it's 5,000 BC. Again, varying, their origins tend to go back further than the Egyptians, admittedly by the Egyptians themselves. So let's take this other quote by Marcus Justinus. He says, the nation of the Scythian was always regarded as very ancient, though there was a long dispute between them and the Egyptians concerning the antiquity of their respective races, the Egyptians being confounded by these arguments. The Scythians were always accounted the more ancient. So again, the Scythians, if you look them up on Wikipedia, they give them, they're assigned a hard date, and that's around between 2400 BC all the way to like 600 AD, around there. And that's it. They start and end there. But the problem with that is because of the tendency to do that in science and academia, it's hard to really tell what happened and how they came to be in the first place. And a people like the Yamnaya culture, whoever you want to call them, Cimmerians, whoever it is, these pastoralist people from the steppe, the way they spread is anything but what they're trying to say in history, in the way that we're taught. And that insofar as, okay, here's the people who came up here, therefore, for example, for the Persians came up here and they're just Persian people. They've been here, or they started here at this point and then they end at this point. But then no mention is ever made of how that initial population came in. And a lot of the times, again, the answer to that is these pastoralist people who mastered horseback and domesticating the horse. And that is a big part of their culture that we'll get into in a second. So yeah, we have this Yamnaya culture that they're talking about, which for all intents and purposes we'll assume are the same people as the Scythians and even the Germans and all these people who moved into Europe with this genome, the R1A and R1B genetic marker. So again, now with the rise of paleogenetics, this picture is becoming more and more clear. 3 waves of immigrants settled, quote, immigrants settled prehistoric Europe. The last, some 5,000 years ago, were the Yamnaya, again, the horse-riding cattle herders from Russia who built imposing grave mounds like the ones near Serbia. And I think they call them the Kurgans sometimes. Anyway, they have these burial mounds that are littered all across the continent, and it's very, very, very interesting stuff. Again, this new genetic data has caused an explosion in new information that, again, is transforming archaeology. Whether they like it or not, it's transforming the picture. And whatever the naysayer, wherever they stand, they're going to have to argue against this data, and that's a really, really hard position to argue from. And in most cases, according to who you ask, is inarguable, because this data is so conclusive. The genomes, in 2018 alone, the genomes of more than 1,000 prehistoric humans were determined, mostly from bones dug up years ago and preserved in museums and archaeological labs. And that's the other thing. There are a lot of stuff that was dug up, but they didn't know what to do with them, and they were just locked away. And there's a ton of stuff like that. And again, they're available upon request. So it's people who have this interest, who are in academia, are the ones that have the responsibility of recovering these artifacts and redating them and applying these new techniques, these ever-changing, ever-improving technological techniques of dating these artifacts. And again, these results are revealing clues to the identities and origins of these humans. So they've been able so far to map out the movements of these people, again, because of the genetics. They can see where the genetics moved, and from there they can develop a rough time frame of when the genetics came into Europe. In addition to the Indo-European linguistic evidence that exists, that's just one part of this huge, I guess, melting pot of information that is being condensed and organized and refined, so people like me can talk about it, and people like you could understand it. The last major contributors to Western and Central Europe's genetic makeup arrived from the Russian steppe as Stonehenge was being built nearly 5,000 years ago. Again, this is from National Geographic, so there's some conflicting stuff in here. So they talk about the first wave out of Africa. We don't really have to talk about this, but around 60,000 years ago, what they say anyway, these people came out of Africa and went into Europe. Although I did do a video not too long ago that dates the first human skull, the earliest human remains found in Greece in Europe 210,000 years ago. So this article fails to take that into account, but I'm willing to overlook that. So the first part of the article talks about this first wave out of Africa, and then the second wave out of Anatolia, which is about 9,000 years ago. This is around Göbekli Tepe again. This is the advent of agriculture in Asia Minor, where they believe agriculture originated. This population of people comes into play, and then they spread into Europe, and that can be seen. Where is it? Well, anyway, if you just look at this map here, the quartered ware, the Yamna culture here. So again, these people who were here already are allegedly the people from the Konya Plain in Anatolia, which is, again, Turkey's breadbasket, the home of agriculture. These people spread to Europe, and that is supposedly the second migration, the second wave of people to populate Europe. And then again, to Britain, the Anatolian genetic signature is found wherever farming first appears. So you can see these people are their genetics still persist to this day, which is why we're able to map out where they came from and when. These people had light skin and dark eyes. They looked different. They spoke different languages, had different diets. So again, we have this contact of people who are, I guess, allegedly mingling with the people from out of Africa from 60,000, 70,000 years ago, according to this article. And then 5,400 years ago, allegedly, everything changed all across Europe. Neolithic settlement shrank or disappeared altogether. This might more than likely have to do with climate shifts and catastrophic events. For every 2,500 or so years, there seems to be some sort of cosmic event that adjusts the climate abruptly. And we saw the same thing with the Green Sahara turning into the Sahara Desert now, the Younger Dryas boundary, and there's a 6,000 year impact event, the 8,000 year impact event. So 5,400 years ago, around there's less stuff, less material, less people, less sites. So it's hard to explain. It's kind of like this gray black hole area in our history, this blind spot, if you will. So there's about a 500-year gap. The population seems to grow again, but then there's something very different. The demographics are different. The villages and egalitarian cemeteries of the Neolithic were replaced by imposing grave mounds covering lone adult men. Again, these are the Kurgans that they're talking about. Farther north from Russia to the Rhine, a new culture sprang up called the corded ware, which is named after its pottery. So this is a corded ware culture. So they believe that these people came from the Yamna culture, and the Scythians, if you want to call them, came from the Yamna. They went the other way. And if you guys look at this graphic, this kind of explains more. So you start with the Yamna culture, and then you have the people in the Danube Valley, and then the Anatolians, and then you have this culture way out east, and then the Danube Valley spreads, and then these become the corded ware people, all springing from the Yamna culture. And then you have the Armenians and Greeks, and then the Andronovo culture, and then you have the people in the Tarim Basin. And again, this is all a theory, by the way. And then they later become the Scythians, and then the Germanic, Slavic, Baltic, Celtic, Italic people, the Balkan people, all stem from there. So, and then here's another graphic. These are allegedly the Scythians, or whoever it was, the Proto-Indo-Europeans that started in the Pontic Steppe here, Black Sea, Caspian Sea. And then they spread in all directions, pretty much. They go around here, and they go south. They go east and then south. And then they make almost a U-turn here, and they become the Proto-Iranians. And then these people go down and become, they go to the Indian subcontinent. And then these people go further east into Asia and the Tarim Basin and the steppe east. And then there are people who go north and west into Europe. Very interesting stuff, and I hope this is definitely not as confusing as the Siberia and the peopling of North America, that part of history, which is a completely other conversation. Okay, so we have this corded ware culture who are closely related to the Yamna culture and these Proto-Indo-Europeans. And again, this third wave out of the steppe, this is a Kurgan hypothesis here. There is this mound erected 4,700 years ago, and then there are other mounds near the Danube, again 10 feet high, 100 feet across. These things are littering the entire continent, like I said before. Underneath, there's a rectangular chamber containing the skeleton of a chieftain lying on his back with his knees bent. Again, this guy was a high-level, high-ranking guy within their largely pastoralist society. And this change of burial customs around this time, again, indicates some sort of switching of the roles of men, the roles of the people on the earth, different types of weapons. Again, this huge change on a massive scale. So this period of 500 years where seemingly nothing happens, we don't have any evidence, or not a lot of evidence of stuff happening. And then suddenly there's all these people. So again, this is a very interesting time in history that not a lot of people understand, and rightfully so, because there's not a lot written about it, and there's not a lot of stuff that survives from that specific period. So again, it makes sense that some sort of climate shift happens, some sort of plague maybe, although they haven't found evidence of a plague at that time. But that's also possible as well, especially when you're dealing with a new population of people coming into an area that they're not originally from. On what are now the steppes of southern Russia and eastern Ukraine, a group of nomads called the Yamnaya, some of the first people in the world to ride horses. Again, these people had the huge advantage of domesticating the horse first. And according to our history, these tend to come out of nowhere. But again, that things don't happen like that in history. At least I don't think so. And they must have had this, because their mastery of the horse was so precise. Their abilities were so honed and so high level that they must have been learned and passed down. It must not have happened by coincidence. I don't. Some people are willing to use coincidence as just a reasoning, at least as a placeholder until something more compelling happens. But I just feel like on a large scale, such as this, I don't think coincidence suffices here. But anyway, that's up to you guys to decide. They had mastered the wheel by now. They were building wagons and following herds of cattle across the grasslands. They didn't have that many permanent settlements, but they spread out a lot. They covered a lot of ground. They buried the most prominent men with bronze and silver ornaments and huge grave mounds that still are there today, again called the Kurgans. The Yamnaya shared distant kinship with Native Americans whose ancestors hailed from the farther east in Siberia. So again, these types of people are very, very far-reaching. Even as far west as Ireland, these people share the same genetic markers. And let me show you this, where is it? This migration route here. So this is the R1A1A1, the R1A migration rather. And if you see the middle here, let's look at the Yamna culture here. This is about 4,200 BC or so. You can see these migrational patterns here, and this is all from genetics. So again, these people spread to the west, about 2400 through the Danube River. They follow the Danube, and then they just keep following the Danube until they hit Germany, and obviously the Balkans first, and then the Corded War expansion coincides with this. And these people, again, the Corded, no matter who you call them, they have very, very similar societies in the way that they conducted, their day-to-day living. And then you have these people, 2500 BC, 1800 BC, they go out east. The Androvno expansion, 2300, 1400. So again, you can see this spreading of people. And if you imagine this as like a tree, this is where the tree trunk is right here. This Yamna culture, or allegedly what the Yamna is. And then they branch out, and there's just so many branches, guys. And the fact that their language is still there, and the language is spoken in all the places that they've been to, it's just, the puzzle pieces cannot become more clear. And again, they address plague epidemics in the article here. Plague epidemics clear the way for Yamnaya expansion. Again, this is an evolutionary biologist who helped identify ancient plague DNA. So there was some sort of plague back in those days, and they found it in ancient Neolithic skeletons. No one has found anything like the plague pits full of diseased skeletons, which is what a lot of people were looking for and is indicative of a plague, just like what happened in the Black Death. So if a plague did wipe out Europe's Neolithic farmers, again, the people who were living there before these Indo-European, Proto-Indo-European, Scythian, these horseback people came in, it left very little trace. So maybe they burnt all of them. Maybe something happened. Who knows? Maybe they got washed away in some sort of cataclysm, or maybe they're still there and yet to be found. Who knows? They might be in a peat bog somewhere. Whether or not they brought the plague, the Yamnaya did bring domesticated horses and mobile lifestyle based on wagons into Stone Age Europe. And again, the Romans will tell you they've been here long before, and they've been conquering people long before the Romans even became a republic, let alone an empire. The arrival on the continent matches the linguistic pinpoint as the initial spread of Indo-European languages. I mentioned that earlier. A family of hundreds that includes most languages spoken from Ireland to Russia. And this is no coincidence, I don't think. I think these two facts they're interlinked, so interwoven so closely together that you can almost assume that these people were speaking this language, and they're the progenitors of the Indo-European, Proto-Indo-European language family. Very interesting stuff, guys. So anyway, I highly recommend you watch or you read this article. Just take it with a grain of salt, because there's a lot of stuff going on in this article. But a large part of it was this idea that I was talking about on Grimerica, which was concerning the Scythian people and how they relate to the genetics of modern humans now and how they spread. And it's a good case study to see how in such a short amount of time one group's genetics could become could account for a huge percentage of the extant current living population. And perhaps if it happened in this one instance, it must have happened in a bunch of different instances. And the further you go back, the more tangled the cord gets in terms of Neanderthals. You have Denisovans. You have those two extinct hominins that we know exist in our genetics, but we don't know exactly where they came from or their migration patterns. So you could bet that a DNA type of replacement event could occur in history, and it's not out of the question that happened. And in fact, it's probably safe to say that it's happened several times in 2 million years of the genus Homo being around. So anyway, let me know what you guys think about this, and I'll talk to you guys later.